or his standing. Amongst the bustle around number 10, one of those so-called Labour greybeards who'd urged caution on Mr Brown.
What do you think of this greybeard line?
My children think it's hilarious.
But you must be relieved there isn't going to be an election.
Well, I think I wasn't entirely convinced there was going to be an election, were you?
I'm afraid at one point I did, yeah.
Gordon Brown's fight back begins with a press conference here in Downing Street, meeting political journalists, some of whom aren't too pleased at the suggestion being made that the talk of an election was all a media confection. Will Mr Brown be willing to accept that he or his advisers made certain mistakes? From the start, he was on the back foot, admitting he had thought of holding an election.
Yes, I looked at it. My first instinct, if I were honest with all of you, was that I wanted to get on with the job of putting my vision of what the future of the country was to the people of the country and deliver on it before there was ever an election. But I did listen to people. I looked at what people were saying. I heard from candidates in marginal seats. These candidates in marginal seats were telling us that we would win the election. I happen to believe we would win at any time.
So, no more attempts to blame it all on the press. But he stood by his entourage of young Turks who wanted an election and led us journalists to think he'd call one.
As far as advisers are concerned, I take full responsibility for everything that's happened. I will not put blame to anybody else. Anything that happens in Downing Street is the direct responsibility of me, and I will always take that full responsibility myself.
The questions were fierce, angry even. Again and again he was asked if he'd been swayed by recent bad polls. His notes show it was a pre-planned decision to say he'd seen the polls but not been moved by them.
I had decided I would make my decision at the end of the party conference season. If you like, I could have made it earlier. Perhaps I should have made it earlier.
It was strange. He'd almost gone out of his way to take blows from reporters. So, what did they think?
He was very much the bear being baited. He was up against it. He was paying the heavy price for the blunder that he's made. But he looked pretty robust and as if he'd survive in the long run.
I thought Gordon Brown dug himself deeper in. He was disingenuous, complete failure to be honest and straight with people. If Tony Blair had been handling that, he'd have said it's no sin to want to win. And of course, I mean, only a maniac would not look at the polls.
Out of it will come a horror.
Meanwhile, up the road in Trafalgar Square, another demo by the Stop the War coalition.
This event coincides with the second part of Gordon Brown's attempted fight back in the House of Commons this afternoon, when he makes a statement on Iraq, and when the opposition parties, no doubt, will once again accuse him of playing politics with British troop numbers.
Following his controversial statement last Tuesday in Basra on troop withdrawals, news that numbers will be cut further, from 5,500 to 2,500 by next spring. David Cameron, though, chose to dwell on last week.
On reflection, does the Prime Minister agree that the way in which he made the announcement about troop withdrawals last week and the way it was briefed to the press were mistakes? He promised to make such announcements to the House of Commons, but he didn't. He promised 1,000 of our troops would be brought back before Christmas, yet isn't it the case that 500 of them had already been announced and 270 of them were already back in the country? I have to say to the Prime Minister, this is of a different order of magnitude to what we've had from him over the last decade. This is not double counting of government spending. This is not just spinning the good bits of a budget. This is about dealing with people's lives and the families of our brave servicemen. And does he agree with me that this is just not an acceptable way for a Prime Minister to behave?
I make no apologies for visiting our troops in Iraq.
And he said,
if we are to have a responsible politics in this country, then ministers who hold responsibility for the safety and security of our armed forces must visit our armed forces, listen to what they say, draw on their advice, and then make the decisions, which is what I'm announcing today.
Campbell, a persistent critic of the war, having just 2,500 troops in Iraq was pointless.
Mr. Speaker, the harsh truth is that Britain's involvement in Iraq has been a catastrophe. We have paid dearly in lives, resources and reputations. And isn't it time to acknowledge that the presence of British troops in Iraq no longer serves any realistic military or political purpose?
It was the Commons back to a more level playing field. Gordon Brown no longer in full command, no longer Mr. Invincible. Judging how MPs would react to his statement on Iraq was probably pretty easy for the Prime Minister. Rather harder for him to gauge would have been tonight's meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Labour MPs were pretty divided on whether an election was a good idea, but they've been much more united on thinking the whole affair was badly mishandled. Yet a packed Committee Room 14 saw no bloodbath, not even a squeak of dissent. Recent events had flushed the Tories out, Mr. Brown assured his MPs. They'd been forced to reveal their manifesto. Now Labour should counter that manifesto. Starting, he said, tomorrow.
Michael's with me now. What are you hearing from the Parliamentary Labour Party tonight?
Well, I mean, quite a strong hint there from Mr. Brown. I don't wish to steal Stephanie's thunder later in the programme, but that he may well be tempted, or he and Alistair Darling may well be tempted, to steal some of the Tories' clothing on inheritance tax, non-domiciles and stamp duty. Also, a lot of talk tonight about the Ashcroft money, this huge war chest, millions of pounds of Tory funds, which Lord Ashcroft, the Tory strategist, hopes to direct to marginal seats. Now, Labour MPs in these marginal seats are extremely worried that they're going to be outspent over the next year or two that they now know there is before an election, and maybe facing expenditure of £50,000, £100,000, which is perfectly within the law. There are no expense limits before an election is called. Now, they were saying the law should be changed. Gordon Brown said he'd think about that.
What are we to make of Gordon Brown's overall performance, do you think?
Well, he was on a pretty difficult wicket. I think in the circumstances he did rather well. Clearly, this was Gordon Brown on the defensive for the first time, really, since he became Prime Minister. And I think, certainly in handling journalists and the Commons, it was never going to be a day of great triumph. Yes, I think he did not badly.
What about the other party leaders?
Well, David Cameron, clearly the Conservatives are in good cheer again after the last week and after a dreadful summer. Ming Campbell also made a pretty strong intervention in the Commons, but I think there could be a lot more focus on Ming Campbell now. The war is rapidly declining as a political issue, partly because of the troop numbers. The Lib Dems are being squeezed in the polls. So Ming was pretty much safe, I think, so long as there was the prospect of an early election. Well, it now looks like we're not even going to get an election next year. There could be more mutterings about his leadership, more pressure on him, perhaps, to step down.
Michael, thank you.